The cathedral bells rang for a king's wedding, but this was no simple love story. On June 11, 1509, Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon in a private ceremony. We're told there was a romance for the ages, a young king marrying his brother's widow out of passion. But that's the fairy tale. The reality was a cold, calculated move on the chessboard of Europe. This marriage wasn't about Henry's heart. It was about an alliance with Spain, the most powerful empire in the world. Catherine was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs who had unified Spain and funded Columbus. She was a human treaty, a living, breathing guarantee against a common enemy, France. For 38 years, Henry would use his marriages as his primary foreign policy. The 6 wives weren't a series of personal tragedies. There were 6 distinct phases in a single, long war. The real players weren't Henry and his wives, but the 2 superpowers fighting for continental dominance, the Habsburg Empire and the French Valois dynasty. Every wedding was a strategic deployment, every divorce a political realignment, and every execution the collapse of a foreign policy. This is a story of how the most famous marital history in England was actually a desperate, decades-long struggle for survival between giants. The Spanish anchor, Catherine of Aragon. For the first 20 years of his reign, Henry's England was firmly anchored to the Spanish Habsburg cause. Catherine was more than a queen. She was the embodiment of the Anglo-Spanish alliance. This partnership delivered immediate results. In 1513, Henry invaded France with the backing of his father-in-law, Ferdinand. The campaign was a stunning success, culminating in the Battle of the Spurs, a victory that allowed Henry to capture the towns of Terouenne and Tournai. It was the greatest English military success on the continent since the 100 Years' War, and it was made possible by Habsburg support. Catherine's value was proven beyond doubt while Henry was away at war. He left her as a regent of England, and it was during this time that a Scottish army, honoring the old alliance with France, invaded. Catherine, the Spanish queen, didn't hesitate. She mobilized English forces, and from her base in London, she oversaw the campaign that ended with the decisive English victory at the Battle of Flodden. The Scottish king, James IV, was killed. Catherine sent Henry the bloodied coat of the dead king as a trophy. She wasn't just a symbolic link to Spain. She was a capable political and military partner, the linchpin of a strategy that was making England a relevant power. But the entire strategy rested on one fragile, biological reality: a male heir. The Anglo-Spanish alliance needed a king to continue it. A daughter, Mary, was born, but the sons died in infancy or were stillborn. With each passing year without a healthy prince, the anchor that held England to Spain began to drag. The geopolitical landscape also shifted dramatically. Catherine's nephew, Charles of Habsburg, inherited not just Spain, but also the Netherlands, Austria, and much of Italy. In 1519, he was elected Holy Roman Emperor, becoming Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe since Charlemagne. Suddenly, the balance of power was Henry was no longer the junior partner to a strong Spain. He was a minor king on the periphery of a global empire. Charles V had no real need for England. He was focused on his lifelong rivalry with King Francis I of France. Henry's attempts to act as a grand mediator between the two titans at events like the Field of the Cloth of Gold only highlighted his diminishing status. He was trying to punch above his weight, and the Spanish anchor that had once given him strength was now holding him back. The alliance had become a leash. Henry realized that to be a major player, he needed to cut Spain loose and find a new partner. The great matter of divorcing Catherine was, at its core, a geopolitical divorce from the Habsburgs. The French Gambit, Anne Boleyn, and a break with Rome. The instrument for this radical pivot was Anne Boleyn. We remember her as the woman Henry fell for, but her true significance was her background. Anne had spent years at the French court, serving as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude. She was steeped in French culture, fashion, and, most importantly, French politics. She and her family were connected to the faction at the English court that favored a French alliance over a Spanish one. Anne wasn't just a new love interest. She was the perfect vehicle for a complete foreign policy U-turn. This is why the great matter. Henry's campaign to annul his marriage to Catherine was so much more than a personal desire. To break from Catherine was to break from Charles V, and to break from Charles V, Henry had to break from the Pope, who was at that very moment effectively a prisoner of Charles V's troops. After the sack of Rome, the English Reformation wasn't just a theological split, it was a geopolitical necessity. By making himself the head of the Church of England, Henry was declaring independence from the Habsburg-dominated Catholic Church. It was the ultimate act of defiance against the emperor, and France was quietly encouraging it. The French ambassador was a frequent visitor to Boleyn, and King Francis I saw a tremendous opportunity. England alienated from the Habsburgs was an England that would have to align with France. French diplomats hinted at support, perhaps even a royal marriage for the son they assumed Henry and Anne would have. For Henry, this was the grand bargain. Trade the stale Spanish alliance for a dynamic new partnership with France, secured by a new, fertile, and pro-French queen. The execution of this gambit was brutal. Henry defied the Pope, tore England away from Rome, and married Anne in 1533. But the payoff never materialized. The French alliance he desperately wanted remained elusive. Francis I was a pragmatist. He was happy to see Henry and Charles V fight, but he wasn't willing to commit fully to England's side. The promised strong military alliance never came. Anne, meanwhile, failed to produce the vital male heir, giving birth only to a daughter, Elizabeth. By 1536, the French Gambit had collapsed, and Boleyn, the queen who embodied the pivot to France, was now a liability. Accused of adultery and treason, she was executed. Her fall wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the dramatic, bloody failure of a foreign policy. Henry had burned his bridges with Spain for a French promise that turned out to be empty. He was now adrift, a king without a superpower patron, his kingdom isolated and his reputation in tatters across Europe. The proxy war had claimed its first queen, and Henry was left with nothing but the consequences. The search for neutrality. Jane Seymour and the Cleves Disaster. Humiliated and isolated, Henry needed a reset. The failed gambits with Spain and France had left him dangerously exposed. His next move was a deliberate step back from the European superpower struggle. Just 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. She was the antithesis of her predecessors. English-born, from a traditional family with no deep foreign ally, she represented a new strategy on England First policy. This wasn't about picking a side in the Habsburg-Valois war. It was about stepping out of it entirely to secure the Tudor dynasty from within. The strategy seemed to work brilliantly. In 1537, Jane gave birth to a son, Edward. The succession was secured. For a brief moment, the relentless pressure of the proxy war eased, but Jane's death, just days later from childbirth complications, left Henry with an infant heir. And the same old problem. England was still a mid-sized power, stuck between two giants. The search for neutrality had to continue. With the succession fragile, Henry needed to build a protective alliance without falling back into dependency on France or Spain. His gaze turned to the Schmalkaldic League, an alliance of German Protestant princes who were a thorn in the side of the Catholic Emperor Charles V. This led to the marriage with Anne of Cleves in 1540. It was a pure, calculated move of realpolitik. The Duke of Cleves was a significant Protestant ruler, not powerful enough to dominate England, but a useful counterweight to the Habsburgs. Portraits were exchanged, treaties were signed, but when Henry met his new bride, he was reportedly horrified. Infamously calling her a Flanders Mare, the personal dislike was secondary to the political reality. The alliance was already falling apart. The Duke of Cleves became embroiled in a dispute that threatened to pull England into a war Henry couldn't afford. The marriage was a disaster because the diplomatic foundation it was built on had collapsed before the wedding even took place. It was annulled within months, a quiet admission that the search for a safe, neutral, Protestant alliance had failed. Henry had been humiliated on the international stage once again. The final desperation Howard and Parr factions run amok after the Cleves disaster. Henry's foreign policy effectively broke down. The grand strategy of using marriage to manage superpower relations was replaced by the raw politics of the Tudor court. The proxy war didn't end. It simply moved indoors, devolving into a vicious civil war by other means, fought between two powerful factions. The conservative, pro-Spanish, and Catholic faction was led by the Howard family, the Duke of Norfolk. The reformist, England First faction was led by men like Thomas Cromwell, until his fall, and later, those around Catherine Parr. Henry's marriage to the young Catherine Howard was a victory for the conservative Howards. She was a pawn in their attempt to steer England back toward the Catholic fold and a reconciliation with Spain. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort to re-engage with the Habsburg superpower. But it was a shallow victory. Catherine's alleged premarital and extramarital affairs were discovered, and she was executed in 1542. The Howard faction's influence crumbled with her. The attempt to pivot back to Spain had ended on the scaffold. Henry's sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, represented the ultimate triumph of the opposing faction. She was a learned, committed reformist who encouraged the aging king's Protestant leanings and helped secure the education and status of his children. Elizabeth and Edward, under her influence, the England First ideology became entrenched. But by this point, the king was ailing, obese, and in constant pain. He was no longer the master of the game, but a captive of the very factional forces his marital policies had unleashed over the previous 3 decades. The war between France and Spain for control of English policy had become a war within his own council chamber. The war Henry lost. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he left behind a kingdom that was the opposite of what he had sought. His 38-year campaign to make England a decisive power broker in Europe had failed spectacularly. Instead of a strong ally, he left a bankrupt nation, deeply in debt from futile wars. Instead of a secure succession, he left a child king, Edward VI, whose minority instantly plunged the country into the very factional conflict that had consumed Henry's court. The Six Wives narrative, focused on bedroom drama, obscures this deeper truth. It was a 38-year failure of foreign policy. Henry tried to play the superpowers against each other and ended up being played by them. His personal life becoming the battlefield for a war he could never win. The real story of the Tudor court is a lesson in the limits of power, a reminder that the personal is always inextricably political. If you're interested in history examined rather than inherited, in evidence weighed more carefully than legend, subscribe to Time Teller Chronicles. Here, we do not look for heroes or villains. We look for how the past actually worked. New episodes weekly.